one of the analytical studies, that is cohort study. Now the meaning of the word cohort means people who share common characteristics. For example, if we look at people working in the same occupation, we can consider it as an occupational cohort. So we can have factory workers, we can have nurses, doctors as cohorts. If we do studies on maybe students, they also become a cohort. So students studying in one particular class become a cohort because they share the same or common characteristics. So what is a cohort study and what is its utility? We have seen in an earlier session that we have got studies which are descriptive in nature, which can describe a particular disease or an health event. Whereas if we want to study relationship between an exposure or a factor which may be related to a disease or an outcome, we have to perform what we call as analytical studies, the example of which is a cohort study. Now, what does a cohort study want to analyze? It wants to analyze whether the exposure or the factor under study is associated with the disease or the intended health outcome. Now, please mark my words, I have used the word associated and I have not used the word caused, because we are going to see in another session that causation does not equal association. In an earlier session on measuring risk in epidemiology, I have spoken a bit about association and causation, but we are going to look at more in details in another session. So for now, let's look at whether an exposure or a factor under study is related to a disease. Now, how do we ascertain these relationships? So to begin with, we need to know how a cohort study is designed and how does it proceed. Now, basically, if you look at reading material available on cohort studies, you can look at two types of cohort studies. One is known as a prospective cohort study and another one is known as a retrospective or an historical cohort study. Now, there is a difference as far as a timeline is concerned in these two kinds of cohort studies. Prospective, as the name suggests, is looking into the future. So we start today and we look for development of new disease in the near future. It could be 10 years time, 20 years time, 30 years time, depending on the objective of the study. Whereas when we look at retrospective studies or historical cohort studies, we are trying to find out where the exposure which has occurred in the past, whether it is related to the disease or the outcome which is occurred presently. So we start with the exposure which has occurred in the past and we look for development of the disease currently or in the present. So that's the basic difference between prospective and retrospective cohort studies. The alternative name for cohort studies is longitudinal studies or incidence studies. Why we say they are incidence studies is because, as I mentioned earlier, we are trying to look for development of new disease or new cases of a disease, and new cases of a disease reflect nothing but incidence of the disease. So we are looking at incidence when we do cohort studies. So that's a very important point to remember when we design a cohort study. Now let's look at the design basically. So where do we start? This is the most important and the crucial point in differentiating between the two types of analytical studies, that is cohort and case control. So for cohort studies, we need to remember that we start with all the study subjects who are free from the disease. So in other words, we start with those people who are either exposed or non-exposed to the factor under study. But the common feature for both these groups is that none of them is suffering from the disease under question at the time of start of the study. So what we begin with, as is seen in the next slide, is we identify the exposed and the not exposed. If I have to explain this with an example, if we consider smoking as our exposure and lung cancer as our disease, we start with all people in our study, included in our study, who are smokers and non-smokers. So we have our exposed group and not exposed group when we begin our study. So next what we do is we follow all these individuals over the given time period of our study. It may be whatever time is being decided by the investigator, maybe 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. Now if we look at development of lung cancer, it's a slow process, a gradual process, and it may take a long time. So we may have to decide on what will be our follow-up time from the start of our study. So we have started with smokers and non-smokers, in other words exposed and not exposed, and we follow up all these people over the given time period of our study. And what do we look at the end of this time period is development of new disease amongst both the groups. What are these groups? Our exposed group, that is the smoker group, and the not exposed group or the non-smoker group. So we look for development of lung cancer in both these groups. What are we likely to get? We are likely to get people who suffer from lung cancer who have been smokers, and we are also likely to get non-lung cancer cases amongst those who do not smoke. So if we have to construct a 2 by 2 table, as you can see in this slide, we can see that we get people who are exposed and suffering from lung cancer as our cell A, people who are exposed but not suffering from lung cancer as our cell B, people who are not exposed and suffering from lung cancer as our cell C, and lastly people who are not exposed and not suffering from lung cancer as our cell D. So using the usual 2 by 2 table, we can put in our cells A, B, C, D the respective counts or frequencies of people who fall under each category. The final table or the final columns and the rows which you can see down are giving you nothing but the incidence. So if you take incidence of lung cancer amongst the exposed people, we take it as A over A plus B. That is, people who are suffering from lung cancer amongst all those who have been exposed to smoking or amongst all those who are smokers. Similarly, if we want to check the incidence of lung cancer amongst non-smokers, we take all the frequencies in cell C and we divide it by C plus D, that is the total of the non-exposed or non-smokers. So what we got from this table is incidence of lung cancer amongst smokers as well as incidence of lung cancer amongst non-smokers. So in a cohort study, what we can initially get is the incidence of the disease amongst both the groups, the study group as well as the comparison group. Please mark my words, I am not using the word control group because this is not a case control study. We have a study group which we consider as those who are in the exposed category, and the comparison group which we consider as our non-exposed or non-smoker category. So the first thing which we have derived after designing a cohort study is what we call as measure of disease frequency, that is incidence. Now the next step which we have to do in a cohort study, that's what is the purpose, that is to analyze whether this incidence which we found amongst incidence of lung cancer which we found among smokers is greater or lesser or comparable to the incidence of lung cancer amongst those who are non-smokers. And how do we do it? We do it by calculating a measure of association known as relative risk, also given by capital RR. Relative risk, as I have explained in another session of measuring risk, is also known as a risk ratio. So risk is nothing but incidence of the disease. So if we take a ratio of incidence among exposed to a ratio or to the incidence among non-exposed, then what we get is the relative risk. So points to remember are for a cohort study. In a cohort study, we get two derivations. One is the measure of frequency, that is incidence of the disease, both in the exposed and the non-exposed group. And secondly, what we get is the measure of association, that is relative risk. Relative risk is only calculated in cohort studies, the reason being the numerator and denominator for relative risk which is needed, that is incidence, can be derived only in cohort studies. So we have to remember that if we have to calculate relative risk, we have to do a cohort study. Now from all this we have seen till now, the last thing which we need to discuss out is what are the pros and cons or advantages and disadvantages of cohort studies. Now since cohort studies are long-term longitudinal and help us to find incidence, we can check for new disease in a population, which is a very useful information which is required for certain diseases. If you look at what we are trying to ascertain, we are trying to ascertain the association between the risk factor or the exposure and the disease. So this we can get via relative risk from a cohort study. So these are the uses of cohort studies, but it has got several weaknesses or disadvantages. As you can see that there is a long time involved in conducting this study, which involves a lot of resources in terms of time, money, manpower, materials, resources. So this makes the whole exercise a very costly exercise. Secondly, what happens is, since this is a long-term study, people who are enrolled at the beginning of the study are likely to lose interest, or some of them are likely to develop disease or die from complications of the disease before even the study comes to an end. So this is what we call as attrition, or loss to follow-up, or loss of study subjects in the study. This is the most common disadvantage of cohort studies. Another thing which can happen with cohort studies is bias. Now what do I mean by bias? Bias is the chance that we make an error either while selecting our individuals in our study, or the information which we get from them, resulting in selection bias and information bias respectively. So what is selection bias? When, as I said earlier, we select our exposed and non-exposed group at the beginning of the study, we have to be very careful as to who we will include in the exposed group and who we will exclude from that. So the exposed and not exposed people should be sharing all other common characteristics other than their exposure status. So this is very important to ascertain when we start the study. If we do not ensure this, that results in a selection bias. Second important bias which occurs in cohort studies is information bias. So people, when they have to share information about their exposure status or no exposure status, sometimes may not give information which is complete or consistent with what was said earlier, and this results in what we call as information bias. So in a carefully planned cohort study, we need to take care that we eliminate both these types of bias. We do not allow these biases to occur by selecting our exposure and non-exposure groups carefully, and secondly, deciding on what information needs to be captured from each study subject enrolled in our study. So this is basically in a nutshell about cohort